executive director at the NEED organization, the National Economic Education Delegation, that I think he's going to talk to us about some today. So with that, Jon, I'd love to just turn the program over to you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Doug. Everybody can hear me okay and see the slides all right? Okay, great. Well, thanks again, Doug. It was great working for Christensen Associates just out of undergrad. It helped me learn a little bit more about economics and the profession. Also helped me later on when I started my own consulting firm. As Doug mentioned, I am the executive director of NEED, the National Economic Education Delegation. And NEED is a nonprofit that I started about 3.5 years ago. I started it really out of my frustration with politicians who, in my view, tend to use economics as a weapon for their own personal agenda rather than as a tool for social good. And over the course of my now lengthy career as an economist, that got increasingly annoying. And I sort of sat back and figured, well, they probably get away with that because the electorate just doesn't know very much about economic policy issues. And the responsibility for that lies squarely on the shoulders of the economics profession. So we know a ton about economic policy issues. We just don't tell anybody. We publish in esoteric journals and then move on. So NEED is sort of my attempt at getting the economics profession out into the wild in a nonpartisan way to give talks about what we know about economic policy issues. I've gotten a fair amount of buy-in from the economics profession. We have an honorary board with 54 members, big names in the economics profession. Most notably is Janet Yellen, our current Secretary of the Treasury, Ben Bernanke, who's a former chair of the Federal Reserve, a bunch of former chairs of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And we have 3 Nobel Prize winners and about 600 members of the delegation. Right, the delegation, that's all PhD, largely academic economists who help us write slide decks, right? So when any of us give a talk on a particular topic, we're using the same slide deck to make sure that we're giving the same message and nobody's going off the reservation, right? We're trying to present what the economics profession knows about a particular policy topic. And there's a ton of agreement in the economics profession about the data, about how to think about things. It's really where we get down to policy prescriptions that views diverge, right? And so NEED will not make a policy prescription unless it's clear that the vast majority of the economics profession agrees on it. Right? We'll talk about different policy solutions, but not push any particular agenda. Right? We don't have an agenda other than increasing economic policy literacy in the electorate. And so that's what brings me here today. I'm going to talk about racial discrimination in lots of economic policies throughout US history. Right. First, I'm going to provide just a little bit of evidence on racial disparities, and then we'll dig into some of the history of policies, and then talk a little bit about some policy solutions. Right. I have to say that preparing for this talk was especially difficult because I have about 2 hours worth of slides, and there is a regrettably large amount to talk about in this regard. So forgive me if I run on just a little bit long, but once I'm done, happy to take questions for as long as you like. All right, so first, a little bit of evidence on contemporary racial disparities, right? So one form of disparity comes from differences in life expectancy, right? In particular, well, it's about 3 years difference between Black and white life expectancy. White men in 2014 were expected to live about 76.9 years, and Black men 73.4. For women, the gap is a little bit smaller, but it's about 3 years on average, the difference between white and Black individuals in their life expectancy. A topic that's getting a lot of play these days is the Black-white wealth gap. I have a whole another slide deck on the Black-white wealth gap and causes, and talks about a lot of causes out there in the popular narrative, and talks about whether or not they're true. Right, but the basics are that mean wealth for white families is about $983,000, and mean wealth of Black families is about $142.5 thousand, right? So the mean is about 7 times greater for white families than Black. If we look at median, right, where median is, if you lined up all the families from least wealth to most wealth, the median would be the family that's right in the middle. Right, so about 50% of white families have net worth of under 188,000, and 50% of Black families have net worth of under 24,000. Right, so an enormous disparity, whether you look at mean or median. And a lot of that is brought about by economic policy history, and I'll talk about that throughout. Another statistic that I wanted to put out there, partly because it shows that things are different for Black Americans than they are for other minorities, right? So these are maternal mortality rates in 2018. For white women, it was about 14.7 deaths per 100,000 live births, more than double that for Black women, and a little bit less for Hispanic women. Right, so the disparity for white and Hispanics actually goes the other way, but it's enormous between white and Black women. And so that's a little bit of evidence of disparities. There are a bunch of bonus slides at the end of my presentation that I won't get to, but I'll be posting these slides up on the NEED webpage, and I'll send a link to that to Jim. Once I'm done, he can circulate it to the rest of you for anybody who's interested. Right, so there are basically, it's sort of, I've categorized policies in sort of 3 different groups. One is policies with discriminatory intent, right? It starts with slavery, right? Obviously discriminatory. And then redlining, we'll talk a bit about redlining and Federal Housing Authority policies. Then there are a ton of policies with discriminatory effect, right? A lot of these policies they hid the discrimination. And we'll talk about some of those. So that's like minimum wage, the GI Bill, perhaps highway location. But there are lots of policies where the effect was significantly discriminatory, but it wasn't written in explicitly. Then we'll talk a little bit about anti-discrimination policies, the Civil Rights Act, and affirmative action. All right, so first, here's sort of just a not comprehensive, but an overview slide of some of the really discriminatory policies and things that happened as a result of policies that really put Black Americans at a disadvantage relative to white back in the day, as well as currently, right? It all starts with the slave trade. You can say this was the first deprivation of wealth. Slavery deprived Black Americans of the ability to accumulate wealth. 40 acres and a mule. When I talk about this at more length, I talk about 40 acres and a mule and how I was taught about 40 acres and a mule, but I was not taught that the 40 acres were taken back and given to the former slave owners. I was also not taught that the former slave owners actually got reparations because they were deprived. I don't remember learning about the Freedmen's Bank. This was a bank where freed slaves could put their money. It was supposed to be super safe, investing the money only in US treasuries. But of course, rich bankers got a hold of it and decided that there was a ton of money to be made in railroads at the time that there was a massive railroad bubble. So this deprived Black Americans of about half of their wealth. Not really time to go through all of the rest of these, but a lot of them you're familiar with, right? Black Wall Street in Tulsa, we just honored that happening 100 years ago, which was an enormous deprivation of wealth. GI Bill, I'll talk about at some length, and then the Federal Housing Authority as well. And the list regrettably goes kind of on and on. So first, here is a list of policies with discriminatory intent, right? There's just no 2 ways about it. These were intended to discriminate against Black Americans. Right? So let's talk a little bit about housing, right? Between 1934 and 1962, federal government backed about $120 billion of home loans, right? 3 out of 5 homes between 1930 in 1959. More than 98% of all that money went to white families, right? And government officials actively argued that Black occupancy of homes in white neighborhoods would reduce property values, right? And it turns out there's been some research on this, that if government officials didn't talk about it in a particular area and Black families moved in, it did not depress home values. But the more government officials talked about it, the greater was the depressing effect on property values, right? And government officials did that because they viewed it as putting a bunch of their loans at risk, right? Well, in the FHA, there was the policy of redlining, and basically they divided neighborhoods up into 4 different groups, right? Grade A, these were homogeneous neighborhoods, and they were not homogeneous neighborhoods if they were all Black. They were only homogeneous neighborhoods if they were all white, and argued that these were, good investments in good times and bad. Right, grade B, it's like a 1935 automobile, still good, but not what people really want today. Grade C, becoming obsolete. That usually meant that more Black families were starting to move in. And grade D, these were neighborhoods that were just primarily Black, right? And we can take a look at what it looked like in Madison, right? Here on the near west side, pardon me. This is the blue area in Madison, another blue area here. Here, Shorewood Hills, nice and green, right? So the west side, blue and green, a little bit of yellow smattered throughout, the red on the south side, and over on the east side, over here at Maple Bluff, right? So, sort of predictable even today, what areas might have been zoned what colors, right? Red areas, largely Black communities, too risky. Yellow areas also suffered from discrimination, right? So it sort of affected the 2 lower categories much more than the upper categories. In the D and C neighborhoods, there was much higher residential segregation, concentration of Black families in C and D, lower home ownership rates, lower home appreciation rates in C and D, right? And I think maybe the lower home appreciation rates were partly responsible for the lower home ownership, right? That and generally the lower incomes of Black families. Lower home values, lower rents, and credit scores in C and D. Right, these trends were mostly reversed in the wake of housing and lending legislation in the 60s and 70s. But clearly, throughout the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, where I live, and in Madison, there's still a ton of evidence. Right, there's a big stickiness, right, of the redlining effects that persists to today. And a little bit more on housing in post-World War II, right? Not so much dominated by redlining, although that did continue, but we started getting residential covenants and discriminatory zoning, right? Residential covenants, you may not sell your house to a Black family, and multifamily zoning or single-family zoning was really a way of keeping low-income families, also largely Black families, out of neighborhoods. Right? And so that's why you get cities like Minneapolis now doing away with the single family zoning. My town, Santa Fe, we're contemplating trying to do away with that as well, but just a ton of pushback on those efforts. And I'll talk more about the GI Bill, but it was largely benefited whites. And then there's discrimination in housing, basically everywhere you look. About 3 months ago, I was listening to NPR and I heard a story about a couple who live in a town just south of me, and they were a transracial couple. They had an assessor, they wanted to sell their house, so they had an appraiser come in to appraise the house, and it appraised about $500,000 lower than they thought it would. Then they whitewashed the house. They took out any evidence in the house that a Black person lived there, brought in another appraiser, and it appraised right about the level that they thought that it would. Right. So as much as we would like to think so, there's still just enormous discrimination in housing markets at pretty much all levels. And so let's talk a little bit about policies with discriminatory effect. Right. How did these policies sort of incorporate discrimination while not actually stating that they were going to be discriminatory or being obviously discriminatory? Well, in 2 ways. And it was, these were ways largely put into bills, forced into laws by Southern Democrats, right? And the first way is to allow local officials to administer the program, right? So if local officials want to do it in a racially discriminatory way, they could. Right. The second is to exclude specific occupations where Black workers were overrepresented. Right? And a lot of these were service occupations, independent contractors, restaurants, maids in homes. Those were all occupations that were excluded. Right. And they were excluded from a ton of really important policies. right? So in 1935, right, the fraction of each race that is excluded or ineligible for Social Security, right? In the case of whites, it was only 27% of whites that were excluded from Social Security. And it was 65% of blacks. And blacks in the South, it was 70 to 80%. Right, and they were excluded largely from Social Security because of the occupations that were covered. It was fairly limited back then. Unemployment, the same thing. Unemployment was worse because there was more discretion for local officials to say, yes, you're unemployed for good reasons, or no, you're unemployed for bad reasons, so you don't get it. And so minorities, Black families, and Black workers fared very poorly under unemployment. And minimum wages also very discriminatory. Same sort of pattern. Right, the same workers that are eligible for Social Security, eligible for minimum wages, right? So a ton of Black Americans excluded. Here's sort of a list of a bunch of things, a bunch of policies that had really discriminatory effect. The Homestead Act went almost exclusively to white Americans, right? And that was just a ton of land that has enormous value today, right? That is partly responsible for the Black-white wealth gap. The New Deal, right? The Wagner Act said you could form unions, but you can exclude people from the unions. So unions tended to exclude Black workers, minimum wages, Social Security, GI Bill, more in a minute. We'll talk also a little bit more about federal asset building policies. And there were local zoning ordinances that I measured, and then incarceration policy, right? We won't talk about that today. There just isn't time, but this is an enormous source of disparities. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the GI Bill. Right. What was the GI Bill intended to do? Well, it was intended to help 16 million returning veterans reintegrate into society. Right? About 1.2 million of those were Black. And it provided loans for homes and farms and businesses, but in a very discriminatory way. A couple of data points on that coming, right? Think about Levittown. I think most of us probably heard about Levittown, but Levittown could only participate in the GI Bill under the condition that it did not sell, that the developers did not sell to Black GIs, right? And a lot of Black GIs couldn't get loans regardless of the government guarantee. Education, Black GIs were steered largely towards vocational training, not to college. Those that did go to college had to go to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And these were underfunded to begin with and did not have the funding to adequately respond to the overcrowding that came in with the GI Bill in the wake of World War II. Right, white GIs went to state schools, went to well-funded and schools that got significant increased funding through the GI Bill. Unemployment was a problem for Black GIs in the South. And instead of coming home to a warm welcome, a lot of Black GIs, if they were wearing their uniform, going down the street, that was more of a provocation than it was a, thank you for didn't provoke much thanks for service. All right, so a little GI Bill by the numbers, right? How much was it? It was federal spending between 1944 and 1971. I think I need to inflation adjust that 95 billion number, but it was about 15% of the federal budget during that time. GI Bill also probably responsible for building the middle class through 200,000 small business loans, mortgages for 5 million new homes, 2.25 million participated in higher education, and 5.6 million GIs enrolled in vocational institutions. But enormously biased, right? Of the vets born between 1923 and 1928, 23% of white vets received GI Bill educational assistance, only 12% of Black. And there are huge differences in take-up rates for Southern versus non-Southern Black veterans, right? But not a difference in take-up rates for Southern versus non-Southern white veterans, right? So just another deterrent to taking this up was being Black and living in the South. Big differences in the number of hours of education that Black versus white workers got. And as I mentioned, big differences in the quality of the educational institution that they ended up going to. In terms of housing, just a couple of data points. In 1947, 2 of 3,200 Veterans Administration's loans in Mississippi went to Black veterans, and 100 of 67,000 loans in New York and Northern New Jersey to Black veterans. So you can see the enormous discrepancy right in there. So the GI Bill, in effect, was sort of white affirmative action for white GIs over Black GIs. And then we can take just a brief look at current government asset building policies. These have been in place for a long time, right? But let's look just at the mortgage interest deduction, right? So these are asset building policies that are really tax subsidies when you get deductions. Think about the mortgage interest deduction, right? That's worth somewhere around $60–70 billion a year, right? But the bars are color coded by income, and the vast majority of that benefit goes to high income families, those with high wealth, right? And I didn't put data up, but Black families tend to be concentrated in the lower income categories, right? So these asset building policies, about $400 billion is spent by the federal government each year, and about $300 billion of that goes to high income families, right? Another source of discrepancies in wealth and in well-being today. There's a little bit on anti-discrimination. So just backing up and thinking about anti-discrimination, whatever its form, whenever you talk about economic policies, you have to talk about the trade-off inherent in the policy. There's likely to be some sort of efficiency loss, right? Folks would argue because the free market is not allowed to work, but likely some equity benefit, right? So there's an efficiency equity trade-off. The same is true with affirmative action, with affirmative action policies. In particular, right, it's possible, but not necessarily true, that anti-discrimination laws are going to hurt the economy. But there is a growing body of evidence, right, that there are positive spillovers to the rest of us, right? If we allow minorities access this at the same rate that we allow access for whites in the United States, there will be tangible benefits, right? One bit of evidence on this is if thinking about talent allocation, just looking at doctors, right? In 1960, 90% of doctors were white men, right? In the ensuing 40 years, only 60, that changed so that only 60% were white men, right? Many more women, many more Black Americans, many more Hispanic Americans became doctors, right? Why did this change? Well, in 1960, there was a large exclusion of women and minorities from access to human development, societal preferences, right? But the studies suggest that the implications of this change, and not just with respect to doctors, but throughout the economy, that allowing this access explains as much as 40% of GDP growth during this period, right? So there's a ton of evidence that affirmative action policies actually, it doesn't harm those who had access prior to increasing access, but it does enormous benefit, relative benefit to those that were sort of held down before. Right, a bunch of anti-discrimination legislation in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, which ended Jim Crow, and I had long since forgotten that Jim Crow was in existence in the South up through really the early 70s. The 1965 Voting Rights Act finally enforced the 15th Amendment that was passed in the late 1800s. And the 1968 Fair Housing Act, right? It addresses widespread discrimination in home sales, realtor services, and rent. But as I've already talked about, there's still enormous discrimination in housing markets at every step of the way. The civil rights movement and legislation dismantled a lot of segregation and discrimination in a wide swaths of the US economy. And as a result of that, between 1960 and 1980, there was significant gains in Black men's wages relative to white men. But from 1980 on, there has been very little, right? And here's an indication, right? So over here, this is how much a comparable Black worker earns relative to a similar white worker, right? And in 1950, that was about 57 cents. So equally skilled Black and white workers, the white worker is going to make about, 43 cents more than a Black worker. That trended down from 1950 to 1960, and then the civil rights era, right, brought in significant gains for Black men in the 60s, more gains in the 70s, a little stagnation in the 80s, had some uptick through the 2000, and now we're down below where things were in 1980, right? So there's been almost no gain for Black men. Well, there's been no gain for Black men in the 50 years following, I'm sorry, the 30 years following 1980, right? And then there's explicitly affirmative action in education, employment, and government contracting, right? Some of the costs to this, there's the potential to displace those other races. But so affirmative action in education is to grant admission to schools of higher education for Blacks, even though they might not get in if you just look at qualifications. Employment, hiring minorities when they're equivalently skilled, and government contracting, a preference for contracting with minority-owned businesses over white. Right, so there are costs. One is the potential to displace those of other races and ethnicities. And the other is to raise costs of doing business, both private and public, right? If you're not going with the lowest bidder, but you're going with the lowest minority bidder, then on significant occasions, that's going to mean you're spending more to accomplish a particular goal. Right, but then there are the benefits that we've talked about, benefits in terms of education, the potential to lift Black and Latino students in terms of post-secondary education, quality of life, length of life, and whatnot. In California, a pretty good case study in what happens in what were the benefits of affirmative action. I forget the year now, but it was maybe 20, 25 years ago, California banned affirmative action. It was Proposition 29 said, government cannot discriminate when it comes to contracting. State schools cannot impose affirmative action. And so there were benefits of getting rid of affirmative action. The cost of government contracts fell by about 5.6% after Proposition 209, right? And we're getting government services at a lower cost, but but the costs are that minority-owned businesses now are not performing as well as they did under affirmative action, right? When it comes to education, right, there were measurable impacts on Black and Latino students, right? And basically what happened was that Black students who would have gone to, under affirmative action, who would have gone to top tier schools were pushed down to second tier. Those who would have gone to second tier pushed down to third tier. Those who would have gone to third tier pushed down to fourth. Those who would have gone to fourth just pushed out of higher education altogether. Right. But it turns out that the Black students and Latino students going to college was a sufficiently small proportion of those going to college that the implications for white students were those going to Division I, maybe they went to a different Division I. There's very little evidence that there is any, with affirmative action, very little evidence that white students were pushed down in terms of school quality, right? No measurable impact on white students of any post-college metrics, right? So yes, there are costs to affirmative action, but the benefits, especially in California, prior to eliminating affirmative action, were measurable and pretty significant. In terms of policy solutions, just a little bit, and then I'll conclude. Right, policy solutions, there are so many places where we can think about solving the inequities that still exist. Right, I tend to focus on asset accumulation. As a result of putting together the Black-White Wealth Gap deck, it's clear to me that this is sort of the root of all disparities. What matters enormously for your lifetime outcomes is sort of your birth endowment, the wealth of your parents, right? And given the gap that I showed you at the beginning, you can guess that matters a ton for the achievement of Black Americans, Black American kids. Right, solutions, just a note that they really have to be multi-domain. It's not helpful to think about solving a problem in just one part of the economy because all of the different areas that I had on the previous slide are really linked. So a comprehensive strategy. And that's also why I focus on asset accumulation, because that one affects everything else on that list. All right, so let me sum up a little bit. There is and has been enormous discrimination in US policy throughout the post-slavery years. There were overt laws on the books until the 1960s. Effectively discriminatory laws were really important in the distribution of wealth across races. The Civil Rights era reduced US policies that were discriminatory significantly, but we still have a ton of discrimination left in the economy. And the effects of more than 100 years of discrimination policy, I argue, is still readily available. All right, so I will stop there. Here's some information about NEED. If anybody would like to contact me, again, I'll send the slides to Jim. So this information will be in the slides. Also, we give talks on a wide variety of issues. So I know you've already had a couple of NEED talks, but if you like more, I'm more than happy to set that up. All right, so let me stop sharing. I apologize because maybe that was a little bit of a fire hose of information, but I hope informative nonetheless and thought-provoking.
All right, thank you, John. Questions? Comments?
I have a question, Eileen.
Yes, Jerry. Go ahead, Jerry.
John, when you compared the GI Bill, you used an age group between birth rates in the 1920s through 1928. Have you compared that to an age group, say, that people born in 1950 to 1960 or something like that? And the reason I say that is because I was in the service during Vietnam, and we had significantly more minorities and specifically Blacks that were part of our group than I would suspect happened, say, in the World War II group of GIs.
Yes, Jerry, that's a really good question. I haven't seen data on that. My sincere hope is that it became less discriminatory by the 60s and 70s, but I don't know. You know, the big deal with what happened right in the wake of World War II is that the numbers were so massive and the spending was so large that the implications of just that one dose of discrimination, an enormous amount of resources going to white GIs relative to Black, has an enormous amount of persistence in the economy.
Kevin Mimi.
Just so many questions come to mind. Really excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And I'm thinking of the flattening of the line during Newt Gingrich, Ronald Reagan 80s era that kind of set the policies in place that are still impacting the wage gap. But my question is about a current issue with some of the Recovery Act money going to minority farmers and an incredible repercussion from white farmers who are not eligible. And I believe that program has been held up by the USDA. Do you know any of the details of that further?
Boy, I'm sorry, I don't know the details of that. I hadn't heard about that, but I'm gonna for sure go and look. You mentioned that a lot of what we're experiencing today sort of started with Newt Gingrich, the contracts with America. In the reading that I've been doing, that the origins of that activity really started in the 1960s, right? One part of the blowback of the civil rights era was that a lot of white Americans sat up and said, wait, what? Some of our tax money is actually going to benefit minorities? And that is when the taste for taxation in the United States really took a nosedive, right? Our rates of taxation prior to the 60s, very high, right? And ton of pressure to bring it down, right? And that's because of a little bit of us versus them mentality. If I'm going to spend my money, I don't want it going to benefits for minorities. A really, really good book on this is called The Sum of Us, and I highly recommend it.
Just to further the old Walker us versus them and his divisive campaigns for governor here, where all the money was going to Madison and Milwaukee, and how many of you live there? And it just, this divide and conquer kind of mentality in politics is so prevalent.
Yeah, it really is.
I've got a question for John. I lived in Baltimore and went to school in Philadelphia and moved into Columbia, Maryland. And the Newtowns were an example of a great opportunity. I was also a city planner, a great opportunity for Blacks to locate without discrimination. Our street had 15 families on it, 7 white, 7 Black, and 1 mixed race. So it was not racial discrimination at that time. It was economic discrimination.
Sure.
If you could afford to go into Columbia, you could, whether you were white or black. Same thing for Reston and most of the new towns. Have you got any feelings about whether that's too limited in a sample, or what kind of opportunities that might have offered for us to grow with?
Yeah, my guess is that is a fairly limited sample. But probably during the period that you're talking about, there was enormous economic discrimination, a part of which was racially motivated, right? I mean, I mentioned single family versus multifamily zoning, not racial discrimination, but income discrimination, really, that had the effect of being racially discriminatory.
Additional questions?
Get Janice.
Janice?
Oh, Janice, you're muted, Janice.
Yes. It was a wonderful talk, John. Thank you so much. I actually live in Ireland. I'm just sort of a guest attendee here. But what strikes me so much living outside the United States is how schools are funded by local property taxes, and how that just, has the roll-on effect of entrenching those inequalities. Because there's housing inequalities, it means necessarily there are educational inequalities. What is the historical backstory to that? How did it just become local property taxes? Why wasn't it least statewide? Or here in Ireland, it is national.
Yeah, seems to me that I came across the reasons for its origins at some point, but I do not remember. And if anybody else on here remembers, I welcome you to speak up. But thank you for raising that issue, because it's even worse than just the funds being allocated on a property tax basis, right? Because over the course of the last 20, 30 years, the amount of parental giving to schools has increased enormously, right? So I gave a talk a couple of years ago in just south of San Francisco, where we're talking about inequality, and I got on my soapbox about school giving and how my son's elementary school raises about $200,000 a year, and the elementary school 4 miles down the road raises $3 million a year. And after the talk, a woman came up to me and she said, my kids' schools raise $1,200 a year, and we thought that was great, right? And so not only is the inequality, racial and income, furthered by property taxes, property tax funding of education, but then the parental giving, which is tax deductible, on top of that, leads to and exacerbates those inequalities enormously. Yeah, down in near Palo Alto, there's a town called East Palo Alto, just the other side of a highway, right? And it's primarily Black, and just the difference between one side of the highway and the other is enormous.
Do you think is there any movement to change that, to not fund education by local property taxes because of the knock-on ramifications of it?
Well, in California, we have changed things. So it's still related to property taxes, but there are adjustments that are made. All of the property tax money goes to the state and then gets redistributed. I don't know of any other state that has changed things, but I really do hope that we can move away from that system, because as you pointed out, it's enormously inequitable on both income and racial grounds.
Fantastic.
I just like to comment that I really appreciated the whole program, and I appreciate that you have 500 or 600 PhDs trying to come up with policies. But I would just want to push back a little bit and ask, what input have you had from people that you're trying to help that are not PhDs?
From the electorate? Well, every single talk, just as with this one, getting input on how we should be presenting this, and what sometimes we've gotten right and we've gotten wrong. So we've given more than 500 talks now. So we've taken in a lot of feedback and incorporated it to the best of our abilities into the slides that we present.
Kevin?
I was just going to comment that in this current legislature in Wisconsin, they have reaffirmed, they being the Republicans, a 67% state commitment to K-12 education costs. It's dipped below that for many, many years. It was passed several decades ago to get state funding levels up and uniform. But there's still inequities in the funding equations where the rich districts, more stable districts tend to get more per student. And so there's inherent discrimination in our own funding policies for education.
Yeah, and that's really hard to get rid of, right? Because those who have the most input onto policy are those who have the most resources.
Jim Patch?
Just to follow up on the education issue, a few years, well, it's probably been about 20 years ago, there was a lawsuit against, I believe, the state that tried to get the state to believe or understand or whatever, however you put it, that there was in fact discrimination between the low income, low property tax school districts and the high property tax school districts. And the discrimination, of course, was on top of the students because they didn't have the same access to education. And the lawsuit was lost. Wisconsin said, I don't know what the deal was, but no discrimination. Also, to ask more about the impact of need. You said you had 500 talks. Well, going beyond that, has anything changed in terms? How can you measure that what you are doing is what you intended to do?
Yeah, so really the only way that we can currently measure it is the extent to which we hear from people and they say, you know, I now understand things a little bit better than I used to. You know, measuring a discernible impact on policies, I don't know that we're ever going to be able to do that. And you know, that's part of what's made it very hard for Need to get funding, is because we can measure the number of talks, the number of people we've spoken to, but we can't say we influenced this policy or that, or that we had any difference on policy formation at all. It's a little bit of a blind leap of faith, and I say a heavy lift and a but if you don't try, you never succeed. So I'm gonna take it on faith that Need's gonna have some impact. But Jim, going back to the discrimination, you stirred a memory that it's not only the local tax base, property tax base, that ends up in causing education to be discriminatory. Even within school districts, the amount of discrimination that happens is enormous. I went to a school board meeting in my school district, and the first person that stood up was a Hispanic woman or Latino woman who she was begging and pleading for air conditioning in the school, and she talked about the half measures that had been done, big industrial fans put in the hallway. Well, those things are loud; you can't teach with those. But the next person that stood up was a parent from a largely all-white high school who stood up thanking the school board for the funds to put air conditioning in the school. A slightly awkward moment at the school board, but it's even within districts, the discrimination is horrendous.
Milwaukee's probably a good answer to that. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question if there is one.
I was just going to ask about reparations. What's your feeling on that?
I think that we need to do something, whether that means outright payments. Well, so one issue is that our reparations laws, as I understand them, say that only those who are directly impacted can receive reparations, right? Well, all of the slaves are long dead. So that's what a lot of people used to argue against it. But at some level, I don't care what the law says. We have these enormous discrepancies. We have to do something about it. As I mentioned, I think that your wealth endowment, the wealth of the family that you're born into, matters enormously. So if we can change that with things like maybe some of you have heard of baby bonds, right? That is, you put when somebody's born, you put $10,000 in an account, and that grows and doubles and triples while it accumulates interest until they're 18, and then they've got this pot of money when they're 18. They can go to college, they can start a business, they can get needed health care. They can use that money for whatever. So that's not specifically reparations because that applies to everybody. The proposal was I just heard the other day was, well, suppose we just have tax breaks for Black Americans. That would be one way of reparations. Another suggestion is that we have another Homestead Act. There is a ton of government-owned land that could be very productive. Well, let's let that open for settlement for African Americans. We need to do something about the discrepancies in particular to access, because that harms all of us, right? And just what form that should take, I'm pretty agnostic. That's Need's position, but the evidence is that something should probably be done.